Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. I'm going to teach you a word today from my friend John Vervaeke, and the word is transjective, and it gets at the idea that a lot of things in life aren't exactly objective, and they're not exactly subjective. They're somewhere in the middle. And a good example of this is seeing. I am looking at a camera right now, and, well, the camera is beyond my seeing, but my seeing sort of meets the camera. It's a relationship between my eyes and my brain and the camera that is giving me this perspective and this picture and this image and my knowledge of the camera. If I move my head around, I see the camera from slightly different angles. The camera isn't subject to my will, but I can sort of influence my sight of the camera with my will by moving the head around. The something that we see sort of lives between us. None of us see exactly the same thing. If you were to sit right next to me, you'd see the camera at a slightly different angle than I would. The camera would be the same, but your image of it would be a little bit different. And because both of us see the same camera, we could act with respect to the camera. If, say, Freddie was here, Freddie could be right next to me and he could be in the picture. And I mean, all of life is that way, and it's a fairly simple thing. If a stray dog came into the church, all of us would see the dog and it would be the same dog. Our perspectives on the dog would be a little bit different, and our emotions about the dog would be a little bit different depending on if we liked dogs or didn't like dogs, or how we were feeling that day, or we were anxious about whether the dog was going to disrupt the sermon, etc., etc., etc. We're trying to get between the ideas of objective and subjective. C.S. Lewis, in his book The Problem of Pain, noticed that we seem to have more senses than just the five we normally count. Sight, sound, taste, smell, touch. And he mentions two of them early in his book, The Problem of Pain. One is the numinous, where we sort of sense something spooky or something creepy. If someone would say there's a ghost in the next room, you might be afraid. Why would you be afraid? If they'd say there's a dead body in the next room, you might feel a little strange about that, but the numinous is sort of our sense of the spiritual or the spooky, and it usually elicits a sense of fear or awe. And then there's also sort of our sense of morality, of good, bad, right, or wrong. Now, again, these are a little different because we're talking about things that aren't quite as tangible and touchable as a camera, but most of us would say that the spiritual exists. And most of us would say that morality exists, even though we have a little bit tougher time, sort of, as we usually say, getting our hands on it, because I can get my hands on this camera or this lens cap, but to get my hands on morality or the numinous is a little bit different. But that doesn't mean that those things don't exist, just like the camera doesn't exist, or the camera does exist. Now, people differ in detail, but they can find enough agreement to actually coordinate some of their actions and behaviors and give guidelines for behaviors. For example, killing is wrong, and so something happens, or stealing is wrong, and so everybody in the neighborhood might be able to agree that that incident of theft was wrong, because we have this idea of morality and we sort of share it, even though it's not the possession of any one of us, and it's not exactly, again, something like the lens cap that I can sort of put my hand on, but we have a sense of it, which is exactly why we use that word. It's also the case that senses deprived of that which the sense seeks out start sort of hunting around for them. This camera is set to focus on my face, and in the little screen there's a little box around my face. If I were to put a stuffed animal behind me and move my face, that camera would seek out that little stuffed animal behind me and focus on that. If you go into a dark cave or something like that, even if there's no light and your eyes can't see anything, you begin to sort of see some things because your mind is kind of looking around for something to see. And you might begin to hear things because your ears are looking around, listening for something to hear. And so this quality of in-between transjectivity, as John Vervaeke calls it, is something really tricky. because sometimes we hear things that aren't there, and sometimes we see things that aren't there. Now, our sense of authority is kind of like the numinous and the morality. And again, I say the sense of authority, and all of us understand exactly what I'm saying. We have a sense of authority. Authority isn't exactly like a camera or a lens that I can put my hand on, but people, we sense it and we recognize it, and it changes our actions. If a police officer shows up or is along the side of the road, we might slow down because we have a sense of the authority of that police officer. When you were a child, if your parent would show up, you might have your parents are invested with a sense of authority. And authority is really important. And in fact, we communicate authority in interesting ways. If you look at the state capitol just downtown, all of these architectural features go into trying to develop to us a sense of authority that the government has. It has pillars that go from ground up, and it's a tall building, and it has a dome. It sort of invites us to look up, which gives us a sense of authority. And we feel that, and there's sort of a sense of awe if you go into the rotunda of the Capitol and you look up at the dome. And of course, human beings have been using these kinds of techniques for a very long time. Temples and churches and cathedrals and buildings have used these to give us, okay, there's a sense of awe, a sense of authority, and if in fact we all have this shared sense of authority, then we'll hopefully be able to act a certain way and coordinate a certain way and do certain things. Now, one of the videos I made this week, I said that authority is like climate and competence like weather. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, there's been a lot of discussion about climate for the last couple of decades, and people are always trying to say, well, the weather is sort of day to day, but the climate is a much bigger thing. And climate changes are very slow. Weather changes every day. Authority is like that because authority is very slow moving. You probably had a sense of authority that was built up over time of your parents, or perhaps a beloved teacher, or perhaps a government or something like that. It's sort of like trust. It develops unseen and slowly, but can be betrayed or destroyed in an instant. And if it's lost, all sorts of things fall apart. And that's a good bit of what's been happening in our culture. We sense both governmental and religious authority, and especially those institutions, their authorities have collapsed. And then just sort of like our eyes in a dark cave, people go looking for authority in other places. And once they find it, they follow it and they obey it and they adjust their behavior according to it. Now, a loss of authority can happen quickly, but in terms of a community, it's slow because it's a shared thing. It's a collected thing. Israel in Jesus' day was having a crisis of authority. People were divided as to who should they believe, the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the aristocracy or the Essenes. What group of people should they pay attention to? The promises of Israel as God's chosen people seemed perpetually lost because if they were God's chosen people, why are they suffering so? Via the scriptures, they came to believe that the failure of Israel to provide for the success and flourishing of its people was Israel's fault. They failed to keep the covenant. And Israelite leaders were looking to establish their own authority and establish other authorities through which their authority would be seen through in order for God to return and to make Israel great again. And so when Jesus shows up on the scene, we find this refrain often in the Gospels. End of the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus had finished teaching these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority. And again, they had a sense of it. And if you'd ask them why, they'd say, well, I don't know, is it the sound of his voice, confidence? That often sort of connotes authority. And in contrast to their teachers of the law. So very quickly, these crowds were listening to Jesus and taking cues from Jesus and following Jesus, and they were leaving the teachers of the law that they had looked to before. So they had a sense of this. And again, it's very difficult for people to describe exactly how that works, just like it's difficult to describe the numinous or authority, but they had a sense of this. In Mark 1:27, when Jesus was doing a miracle, so the people were so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority." He even gives orders to impure spirits and they obey him. And so Jesus' miracles were a very big part of his authority because, as we have this saying, actions speak louder than words. In fact, Bart Ehrman, who is himself a skeptic, wrote a book on this, that a big element of the reason Christianity triumphed was because they'd read about the miracles that Jesus did, and then they heard accounts of apostles and other Christian leaders doing miracles, and so they had a sense of authority. And again, you can find this in Matthew 13. Coming to his hometown, he began teaching the people in the synagogue, and they were amazed. Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers? And it's sort of the numinous and the moral senses put together. Now, over the last while, as Jesus made his way to Jerusalem and then into Jerusalem and then crucified, and then Easter when he rose from the dead, we've been sort of working on this question about how did Jesus do it? How did Christianity win, get so successful, topple this entire pagan regime? Because it took a while, but in a few centuries, the pagan temples that people had supported and gone to for centuries before that were simply abandoned and often turned into churches. So you had this shift in authority that had happened, and polytheistic paganism was abandoned, and Christianity by many was embraced. Now people usually expect to win the world through armies and conquest. And of course, there was a lot of expectation that Jesus would do something like that, but he didn't. He did very strange things, and he sort of confused people. And so it's really helpful to pause and say, now, how did he do this? Especially by being crucified, because crucifixion is usually where these sort of movements die. But Jesus' movement didn't die. His disciples claimed he rose from the dead. And as we saw last week, today, because of certain philosophical changes in our culture, people sort of say, well, did he really rise from the dead? And they usually ask that sort of like those first 5 minutes of the resurrection, as C.S. Lewis pointed out. But the Bible doesn't really talk that way. The resurrection to which they bore witness, in fact, was not the action of rising from the dead, which nobody saw with their own eyes, but the state of having risen. A state as they held, attested by intermittent meetings during a limited period, except for the special, in some ways different, meeting vouchsafed by St. Paul. This termination of the period is important, as we shall see, because there's no possibility of isolating the doctrine of the resurrection from the ascension. And when we get to Ascension Day, we'll talk about that. As Lewis again says, the New Testament writers speak as if Christ's achievement in rising from the dead was the first event of its kind in the whole history of the universe. He is the first fruits, the pioneer of life. He has forced open a door that has been locked since the death of the first man. He has met, fought, and beaten the king of death. Everything is different because he has done so. This is the beginning of the new creation, a new chapter in cosmic history. Now, in all fairness, people will say to me things like, well, wait a minute. Come on. People still die. Tyrannical governments still exist, and they torture and kill people. In fact, Christians were tortured and killed by Romans. Yes, they were. And Christians continue to be killed in many places today. Yes, they are. So how exactly can we see this? And again, well, what do you mean see? Well, how exactly can we know this? How exactly can we have a sense of this? And again, pay attention to the language. Now, the same day, this is Easter, the day Jesus rose, two of them, meaning a group of people beyond just the apostles who were in Jerusalem for the Passover, were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. So remember, Jesus is killed on a Friday. Saturday, he remains in the tomb. Sunday morning, he rises from the tomb. But again, because Saturday is their Sabbath, that was the day of rest. Sunday is like the Monday for them in terms of their mind. So they didn't do anything on the Sabbath. And so on Sunday, all right, well, it's time to go back home and to work and to our other obligations. But they're talking about everything that had happened that weekend, the crucifixion, and this claim from the women and from Peter and others, because others went to the tomb and looked in, that his body isn't in the tomb. What can this mean? And again, when we say, what can this mean, we sort of shortchange it. And when I was talking about Palm Sunday and talking about the expectation of the people that Jesus would do something that would change the world, and they had a lot of vague ideas about what that something might be, and we sort of take all those little somethings and we categorize them kind of into a feeling. That's a sense again, because we also have a sense of the meaningful. We have a sense of meaning. What can that mean? So how will that change my life? Just like we asked about that door that C.S. Lewis is talking about, how the door is forced open. As they talked and discussed these things from each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. Now that's the divine passive, and you'll find that all throughout the Bible. And it's sort of God number one-ish. It's, they're kept from recognizing. Well, why? Well, is it because of their shock? Is it because they don't expect to see him? Is it because Jesus looks differently? Why exactly? We don't know. It's just told us they were kept from recognizing him. And Jesus is going to kind of play along with this incognito game, entertaining angels unawares, etc., etc. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that happened in these days?" In other words, the entire city is talking about it. No one could miss it. The crowds, the week of Jesus in the temple, the crucifixion, and then rumors. The tomb is empty. Where is he? And you expect, well, if someone stole the body, that someone would be, talking about the body. Nope. What things? Jesus plays dumb. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. Tells you right there exactly what they thought of him. Jesus was a prophet. And this was a common belief. A lot of the kind of things Jesus said would be sort of mysterious. And we hear that again and again. They don't understand him. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. Tells you a lot about how they regarded or saw the authority of their leaders. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. There it is. Well, we've been talking about almost every week that, well, what do you mean to redeem Israel? Well, we certainly wouldn't be under the Romans, and we certainly wouldn't be paying taxes to that pagan emperor, and we certainly wouldn't have these rulers who are worthless. And, well, what? Well, gold would flow to Jerusalem instead of away from Jerusalem, and our king would sit on a throne, and our armies would go out to conquer, and tribute would be paid by foreign lands, because, of course, in their mind, they think about David and Solomon and Rome and That's the way the world works. And Israel would be rescued from all of her enemies, and she would be top national dog and redeem Israel. Duh, everybody understands that. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning and didn't find his body. What about that? They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. But they didn't see Jesus. Now, remember, they're looking at him. But again, as it says, they're kept from recognizing him. So the seeing is transjective. And I've often thought about these post-Easter sightings and what they could have meant. And this has long been a topic of conversation and speculation in the church. How did Jesus change? Why didn't they recognize him? You know, you're going to have doubting Thomas with the wounds in his hand and the side. But it's all very mysterious and fuzzy. And part of this is just psychological. And I thought one year that, I was thinking, because I have to preach on this every year, and so every year this time I think about it, and I think about illustrations, and I think about analogies, and I try to compare, and I think about, so my father and my sister who have passed. What if they showed up as the door? And I don't think of them in terms of zombies or anything like that in a Hollywood movie, but recognizing people is a funny thing. If, for example, I went back to my high school reunion, unless somebody has seen a picture of me on Facebook or has seen me on YouTube, I'd walk in and they wouldn't recognize me. They wouldn't recognize me at all from high school. So they go into the tomb and they can't see Jesus, and here they're looking at Jesus. Now, what Jesus begins to do is re-knit their authority. Jesus had already been building that through his ministry. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken." Now, remember, it's very interesting that he says, Jesus himself had said this, but he points to the prophets and says, you already believe in the redemption of Israel because that's what the prophets say. Now, I am the fulfillment of that. Now, I want to give a break to these guys because Jesus surprised people. But what Jesus is about to do is sort of re-knit the story and reconfigure the puzzle so that they can see it. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So he runs through that Old Testament, the law and the prophets, and says, this pointed to this, and this pointed to this, and this pointed to this, and it all pointed to this Messiah, and this is the shape of Messiah. He leveraged their existing belief in the authority of the Bible. He leveraged our natural inclination to understand miracles as authoritative. He leveraged the authority that he'd already put in Jesus through the miracles, but it was insufficient. They saw him as a prophet. And he weaves it together into something like sight. It's a sense. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued as if he was going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day is almost over." This is what we saw with, this hospitality game where you see it in the Old Testament in the book of Judges. Oh no, the evening is late, come and stay. And the leaders of the town of Jericho were hoping that they could lure Jesus in. And please, 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 let us extend hospitality to you. So Jesus says, okay. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. Now again, this is so mysterious, because he teaches them sort of when they're still skeptics. And once they see him, that's enough. And he's gone. Why? We don't know. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? And it's like, yeah, but again, these senses are really weird. Didn't quite trust them, didn't quite believe them, but had a sense of it. And now looking back, just like Jesus walking them through the Bible, well, it's a lot clearer now. So now authority has been reconstituted. Now they believe. And of course, the church has long seen this as, well, sacraments, the blood and the wine, the Lord's Supper, baptism, they instantiate the unseen word, and word and sacrament go together. And now they can see. It's like a sense. Jesus has authority. His words have authority. His teaching has authority. And that authority is going to begin to grow in a community. They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. I guess you can travel late now if you really want to. And they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, it's true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon. Then the two had happened on the way, and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. So in other words, the sightings are starting to fit together. They're starting to put the pieces together of a new world, of a new worldview, a new vision of the world, of authority. At the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus will say, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. But will people see that in him? The authority of their world is reknit. The elements come together. They have to tell their friends about it and try to convince them, and there's no time to waste. Now, in many ways, as a culture, even when the faith, there's a crisis of authority. People don't know what to believe. Do they believe the church? Do they believe the Bible? Do they believe a local pastor? Do they believe a radio minister? Do they believe an internet minister? And it isn't easily regained. Again, it's more like climate than weather. And because of this, we tend to be fearful and anxious and divided. And like I said, this is common in history. Jesus looked out and said, they're like sheep without a shepherd. Authority isn't coming through. Authority and credibility go hand in hand, and we trust people who have skin in the game, and this is why the crucifixion is so important. Because it isn't just about words, and it isn't just about miracles, because even the authority that we recognize in miracles seems to leak quickly. But Jesus puts his own life in the game, and at great expense does this for us. And because we trust those who suffer for a cause, and we trust those who suffer for our sake. It's part of the reason people trust their parents. If they had good parents, and the parents sacrificed on behalf of the children, that the children then understand their value and know it. Now on the cross, Jesus gains our trust, and the open tomb proclaims our hope, and we begin to believe that like him we die, and like him we rise. For the climate of authority to be maintained or reconstituted, we need to rehearse it regularly. Again, it's sort of like climate and weather. You sort of judge the climate by the consistency of the weather, which is why we gather regularly. We pray regularly. We learn from the Bible regularly. We take the sacraments regularly. This all creates the climate of authority in which we can believe. We need to hear the word. We need to receive the sacraments. We need to reconnect with the body, the members of Christ, because the funny thing about human beings is that we actually believe together. If you want to believe something, hang out with people that believe the same thing. And we need to live credibly together, because in that way, we begin to trust. These are rough drafts, and I thought of a different ending. I started to write it down, and then I took it away and didn't like it. So there might be a different ending on Sunday. So there it is. It's a rough draft.